Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy and today we are looking at divine inspiration from on high. Divine inspiration. So obviously this is only applicable to games and to settings where you have gods that can manifest, that can be involved, or perhaps that don't get involved but are still there. You have to have some kind of divine system in place for this to make sense. I do feel, however, that this can extend to other areas, such as if we look at Star Wars, we look at Star Trek, where there's these weird little pseudo-magical, pseudo-divine moments that kick in. Both of those have those. Battlestar Galactica had them, so sci-fi can also add in an element of the divine. So there could be some gems in here for you as well. Think about that. So if we look at divine intervention, we have to look at the god's involvement in your system first, then we look at it mechanically, then we look at it narratively, and then we look at it from a balanced perspective, because having divine intervention occurring can cause issues if used incorrectly. So it comes with a giant warning label, use with caution. Let's look at the first one, God's involvement. Now, either they are engaged or they're not engaged. It's as simple as that. Engaged gods are the gods that will manifest when priests call upon them, that will stride the earth, that will, according to Greek mythology, copulate with basically anything in the form of basically anything, or in other words, they are gods that are real. They are absolutely there. They absolutely do stuff. On the other hand, gods that are not engaged, gods that have no involvement in the world, they need to be thought about as well. Distant gods, absent gods, forgotten gods, gods that are no longer in power, all of those kinds of gods can still be added to your setting to bring it to life, to give it a certain divine dimension, if you so will. Now, engaged gods generally means that they are listening to the prayers and to the requests of those that are on the mortal plane. They look down from on high, whether it's Olympus or Valhalla or wherever it might be, and they look down and they hear the prayers of those that need them, and then they act upon them. Not engaged gods, of course, might hear them, but they don't act upon them. So what you need to do is you need to come up with a code of conduct. How do your gods interfere with the mortal realm? Now, generally speaking, pantheons or monotheistic gods, there's usually a restriction. You cannot engage with the mortals, but you can cause an avalanche. You can't directly influence a human to do this, but you can cause a tree to fall on their head. So you need to come up with the code of conduct that your gods are going to abide by. And of course, the evil gods will not abide by, but they need to be there first and foremost. You then need to figure out how to give these to your characters. So with engaged and non-engaged, the religious base, the religious background needs to be there. And of course, it needs to really only be there if you have someone who has a religious background as their character backstory. So a priest or a cleric, someone from the clergy, religious archaeologist, someone who runs around looking for things, anything along those lines. Someone who has a spiritual side, they need to understand the basic mechanics of how the deities might be involved. Now, something that you need to do, and this is right up front, right at the beginning of your campaign, is you need to outline these. You don't have to read all of the sub-appendices and the 53,000 clauses that the gods have got built into this code of conduct. But in broad strokes, you need to say, the gods cannot directly influence outcomes, but they can influence non-organic matter, or they can influence the minds of animals, but they can't influence sentient minds because there's a natural break or whatever. You also need to figure out what is the goal of your gods. Most times, gods are seen as being these omnipotent beings that are amused by the antics of the mortals in their realm, or that they have this sort of fight going on in the background for control over worshippers and that kind of thing. You need to lock that down. What is it? How is it? How is it expressed? And again, what are the rules within their code of conduct? How does it all fit together? Those are things that you're going to have to come up with. Even with non-engaged gods, why aren't they engaged? If they have no interest in the affairs of mortals, what happens if a mortal does try to appeal for help or for aid? What happens if those non-engaged gods start to become engaged? It leads to some very interesting questions and some very interesting adventures that can, of course, manifest as a result of that. So those are the kinds of things that you need to think about when you talk about your gods in your world. How and why do they get involved? How do they get engaged? You then also need to figure out, how do the players get engaged with their gods? Is it through prayer? And I specifically say players here because the characters, I often get players who go, oh, my character does a prayer, and just assume that every single time he goes to bed he does a prayer. I kind of feel like that's copping out of a responsibility. That's like saying, as a fighter, oh, every time there's combat, just assume that I'm going to just hit everything. The prayer needs to be made with a conscious effort on behalf of the player. They need to realize that if the gods are to be engaged with their character, they need to take it to the next level. They don't have to obviously go through the prayer every single night, but whenever it comes to campfall, the player simply needs to state, and I go off and I spend 10 minutes in worship with my gods. It might sound repetitive, it might sound pedantic, but to me, that shows that the player's character is actively involved in their god, is actively there, and is not just paying lip service, because the power that they could potentially call upon will imbalance the game. So there needs to be some non-mechanical balance. You need to show me that you believe that the gods have power, not as a player, but as a character. And the way that your character does that is by the player actively telling me that they are engaged. I find that important. So mechanically, you need to have a system in place that allows for that. Now, in my game, I generally run role-playing games that are D20 based. So that means I have a percentile die that I can roll and determine whether the gods intervene or not. Now, in my game, a house rule, if the character makes a prayer to a god, and I think I've said this before in other videos, if they make that prayer, they roll 2d10. If they get 1%, the god will actually manifest, will actually listen to their prayer, and will respond accordingly, according to the code of conduct that I have established for my gods. If they're clergy, that goes up to 5%. If they are avatars of the god, it goes up to 10%. If the gods are engaged, if they're not engaged, and they roll 1%, which would indicate some kind of godly intervention, what I do, because gods exist because people believe in them, and they only believe in them if things actually happen when they're called upon. So a disengaged god might not directly engage with the player character, might not directly stand in front of them as this giant being of light, but they might cause something to happen that allows a favorable outcome for the character based on that prayer. That's the true power of religion anyway, is that there's a causal link between a prayer and an outcome. If they roll 1%, 1 in 100, I like to give them the benefit of the doubt and give them some kind of incentive for having done all of those prayers. So that's the system I use. I don't know, your system, you might have a system, there might be role-playing systems out there that have all of this built into them, in which case make sure to use it. Now, when it comes to abuse of that system, though, a player who's just constantly praying, oh please, oh please, oh please, oh please, oh please, that's an abuse of the system. So generally speaking, I will allow a player to make a heartfelt prayer. If it doesn't work, they can't do it again. The gods are not listening. For that entire encounter, for that entire space around which that prayer was centered, if they prayed once and it doesn't work, that's it. It doesn't happen again. Similarly, if I have one character who prays and all the other players go, oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, I'm also going to pray. I'm also going to pray. I'm also going to pray. All 5 of you are now suddenly going to pray. Okay, that to me seems like his prayer didn't get heard. So unless you can give me a good narrative reason why your character would now suddenly think that that is going to work, I'm not going to allow it. Or all 5 of you pray. Okay, great, roll. In order for your gods to respond, you still need to get that 1%. But now none of you can roll again for the remainder of the encounter. If the system is there, then you'll be able to use it, but they can't abuse it. I also then take it a step further. If the god they worship happens to represent a specific sphere of influence, a specific type of knowledge or ability, so for example, they worship the god of life, and they pray to the god of life, please help me destroy my opponent, end life, in other words. And they roll that 1%, the god will appear and will destroy the character, because the character prayed to the god to do something fundamentally against the tenets of that god's religion. That's a complete blasphemy, in my opinion, and the god will show it. It's as simple as that. If they pray to the god of life to help heal them so they can survive in the battle longer, that's a different story. The god will appear and will heal them if they roll that 1%. So that's the balance, that's the abuse, that's how it can work mechanically. Narratively, you need to make sure that these beings are expressed as having this ultimate power. They are considered to be gods. There must be a reason for it. They should manifest in a way that is godlike. They should change time and space. They should be this amazing thing. And they should be ultimately fearful. The wizard who's got a magic spell up of protection against evil, an evil god should just swat them flat, gone. No power in the mortal realm should be able to affect a god. Gods being killed by mortal weapons, it shouldn't happen. Gods being killed by created weapons should happen. So they need to be epic. They need to be fearful in their approach. They need to be exacting. They don't have a lot of time on their hands for an individual character. They have an infinite amount of time because they are an infinite being. But for that particular character, if they waffle, if they delay, the god is gone. It's as simple as that. From a balance, if the characters are lucky at rolling and they just using these gods every single adventure to overcome all sorts of things, you need to start having the other gods act against these characters. Why? Well, because they would see that there's this manifestation is happening. The god of life is, well, they're succeeding on all sorts of things. So why wouldn't the god of death start to empower their own champions to go out and stop these champions of life? So you need to bring balance to your adventures, to the power play that will start to shift. If the characters, if the players try to not even abuse it, if they just use it multiple times, if they become the avatar of the god of life, the avatar of the god of death is going to seek them out and is going to try and make it happen and is going to try and force it to happen. Now, before I finish off, I want to give you an example of a game that I ran. It wasn't online, sadly. It was a game that I played with a group of friends of mine where the gods were heavily involved. The one character was, the one player was playing a priestess. This is in a Dungeons and Dragons setting, playing a priestess who worshipped the god of life, death, and rebirth, the cyclical god. Another character was playing someone who didn't worship gods, who was completely irreverent towards the gods. But because the character who worshipped Ner, the cyclical god, was getting favors, they were really working hard, and they came up with prayers that they would utter, and they tried to convert NPCs that they came across. They tried to convert their fellow player characters to their cause, and succeeded, as a matter of fact, because they would recite Ner before healing. They would recite Ner before restoration. They'd recite Ner before detect. So they really got into that whole thing. The god who was in opposition to Ner, because my gods in my campaigns usually are fighting against each other for worshippers. The more worshippers they have, the more power they have. So I had a god of evil, of oblivion, as a matter of fact, start to make pacts with the one player's character who was irreverent. Just casually. And tried to set up these two forces to work against one another. And it worked beautifully. The balance was there, the gods against the gods. I set up other champions of other gods who now sought out this champion of the cyclical god of Ner to try and challenge her, to try and defeat her, to try and bring her low, or bring him low anyway, to prove that their gods were better. And it created this amazing story underneath my campaign. My campaign was still running out and playing out as it had been planned. But there was this wonderful subtext that played through. So they really can be involved. They really can bring an extra dimension to your game, make it feel really, really rich. Again, though, my current campaigns, the gods are there and the percentile thing still exists, but they're not that involved. It depends entirely on the player characters and how involved they get. It is something that is really fun to play through, really fun to explore, as it really changes up your games and takes them to a totally divine level. Yes, I went there. Anyway, until next time, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, join us. We are surging towards that 100,000 mark of subscribers. That would be mind-blowing in terms of the influence that we will have just in making sure that role-playing is as entertaining, as narratively driven as possible, and making sure that everyone just has an absolutely awesome time. So spread the word, build our ranks, so that we can show everybody just how wonderful our hobby is, and continue to do so into the far, far future. Until next time, thank you for watching, thank you for supporting the channel, and happy gaming.